Emily Carter thought she was visiting Dr. Jonathan Hayes for a simple checkup until he pulled a human fingertip from inside her, setting off a hunt that would drag Detective Sarah Whitmore into the twisted trail of a vanished surgeon, Lucas Reed, and the chilling truth behind Vanessa Cole's disappearance. Emily Carter had never been the type to panic over small health issues. She believed in letting her body work things out on its own. But this time was different. For the past week, a strange, persistent itch had been tormenting her. It wasn't just mild discomfort, it was the kind of irritation that gnawed at the back of her mind all day and kept her awake at night. She had tried everything she could think of. Over-the-counter creams, natural remedies, and even dietary adjustments had all failed. It wasn't going away, and it wasn't fading. If anything, it was becoming worse. On the morning of her appointment, Emily woke up feeling unusually anxious. The air in her small apartment seemed heavy. Even the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt muted. She sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing her palms together, trying to convince herself it was nothing serious. Still, the unease wouldn't lift. She picked at her breakfast without tasting it, her mind already at the clinic. The city outside was alive with the hum of normal life. Cars moving steadily down the streets, people talking on their phones, children running to catch school buses. Emily moved through it all like a shadow. The clinic loomed in the distance, its white facade gleaming under the late morning sun. It looked sterile, almost too perfect, the kind of place where everything was in order. That should have been reassuring, but instead, it made her heart beat faster. Inside, the cool air smelled faintly of antiseptic. The reception area was quiet, except for the soft hum of a water dispenser in the corner. She signed in, barely noticing the polite smile of the receptionist. Her hands felt cold, and her pulse was erratic. When Dr. Jonathan Hayes finally appeared in the doorway, his presence seemed to steady the room. He was known for his calm professionalism, a man who inspired trust. Emily followed him down the hallway. The sound fouled her footsteps unnervingly loud against the tiled floor. The examination room was immaculate. Stainless steel instruments, lined neatly on a tray. A paper-covered examination table at the center. Cabinets, with labels so perfectly aligned, they almost looked untouched. Emily tried to focus on the soothing cadence of Dazin's instructions, but the tension inside her chest only grew heavier. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, the faint buzz of the overhead light drilling into her ears. As the examination began, the first few moments were routine, but then Emily felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Dr. Hayes's movements slowed. His breathing seemed quieter, more deliberate. Though his face remained neutral, there was a subtle tightening around his eyes, the kind of look a person gets when they see something that doesn't belong. Emily's mind started to race. Was it something serious? Something rare? She could hear the faint sound of metal instruments clinking together as Dr. Hayes carefully selected a tool from the tray. A sudden, sharp sensation made her flinch slightly, though she forced herself to remain still. It was over in seconds, but in those seconds her thoughts spiraled. Then there was a faint scrape, almost metallic, followed by a sound she didn't recognize. Dr. Hayes moved with a precision that felt almost exaggerated. His gloved hands lifted something small into view, and he froze for the briefest moment. The object was pale, unnaturally so, with a shape that made Emily's stomach tighten before her mind could even name it. He placed it on a sterile pad, and only then did Emily see it clearly, a human fingertip. The nail was intact, slightly chipped, and the skin looked as if it had been severed cleanly but not recently. There was something deeply wrong about the way it sat there, motionless, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. The room felt colder. Emily could hear the sound of her own breathing, uneven and shallow. She couldn't look away from the object, yet she desperately wanted to. Dr. Hayes didn't speak. He didn't need to. The presence of that fingertip said more than words ever could. It was something that shouldn't have been there. Something that didn't make sense in any rational world. And in that moment, Emily understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening to her was no longer just a medical issue. It was the beginning of something far darker. Dr. Hayes did not allow his expression to betray the wave of unease rising inside him. Years of medical practice had trained him to maintain composure, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. The fingertip rested on the sterile pad, its pale skin and chipped nails silently demanding answers. He knew there was no medical explanation for what he had just removed. Something about it felt wrong. Not just in a clinical sense, but in a way that chilled him deep in his bones. Without saying a word, he reached for a sealed evidence pouch from the top drawer of his desk. His movements were deliberate, almost too controlled, as if each action needed to be carefully measured to keep the situation from spiraling. The fingertip slid into the plastic bag with a faint rustle, the sound unnervingly loud in the silent room. He sealed it and held it for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes locked on the small shape inside as though trying to solve the puzzle by staring at it. Emily sat upright on the table, her hands gripping the edges tightly. The cold paper crinkled beneath her, matching the rising tension in the air. Her mind was scrambling for an explanation, but each possibility only led to more impossible questions. She couldn't remember any injury that could account for this. She had never been in any situation where a human fingertip could somehow become lodged inside her body. The thought alone made her stomach twist. Dr. Hayes opened the door and called for Linda Marlowe, the clinic's long-serving administrator. She was a woman who prided herself on efficiency, her posture always straight and her eyes sharp. But when she stepped into the examination room and saw the evidence pouch, her composure faltered. The faint color in her cheeks drained away, and she instinctively took a step back before catching herself. He handed her the pouch, instructing her to secure it immediately. Linda took it with trembling fingers, as if holding something fragile and dangerous at the same time. She glanced at Emily briefly, an unspoken mix of sympathy and unease before walking out, her footsteps quickening down the hallway. Emily could hear the faint metallic click of a lock engaging somewhere in the building. The knowledge that the fingertip is now sealed away in a secure storage room didn't comfort her. If anything, it made the situation feel heavier. Whatever had been found inside her was now treated as evidence, and evidence meant investigation. Within half an hour, the clinic was no longer just a place of medical care. It had become a scene in something larger, something Emily didn't yet understand. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, the smell of antiseptic sharper, as though the building itself sensed the shift. Detective Sarah Whitmore arrived shortly afterward. Her reputation preceded her. 10 years in major crimes, a track record of solving cases others had abandoned. She moved with quiet authority, her gaze sharp and assessing as she entered the room. Without touching it, she studied the sealed pouch Linda had retrieved from storage. Her eyes narrowed when she noticed the chipped red nail polish, the uneven wear along the nail's edge that hinted at recent use before the fingertip had been severed. Emily watched from the corner, every nerve in her body on edge. Sarah's silence as she examined the evidence made the moment feel even more oppressive. It wasn't just curiosity in her eyes, it was recognition. This was not an isolated find. The detective finally looked at Dr. Hayes, her expression unreadable, and then at Emily, holding her gaze for a beat too long. Emily felt as though Sarah was seeing more than she was saying, as though she had already started connecting threads Emily couldn't even see yet. The fingertip was no longer just an inexplicable medical discovery. It was a piece of a story already in motion, one that had begun long before Emily walked into the clinic that morning. And now, without warning, she had been pulled into the center of it. The fingertip was sent to the city's forensic lab within the hour, transported in an unmarked evidence container under strict chain of custody protocols. Detective Sarah Whitmore knew the urgency of acting quickly. Human remains deteriorated fast, and every microscopic trace on that fragment of flesh could be the difference between solving a case and losing it forever. She didn't leave the evidence with anyone else, she rode with it herself, sitting in the back of the transport vehicle, her eyes fixed on the sealed pouch as if daring it to reveal its secret. Emily was allowed to leave the clinic, but the word allowed didn't feel right. It felt more like she had been released into the world with something dangerous hanging over her. She moved through the rest of her day in a fog, unable to stop replaying the moment Dr. Hayes had lifted the fingertip into view. Every time she thought about it, she could feel her pulse spike and her stomach knot. She told herself it couldn't possibly be connected to her life, but deep down, she knew things that didn't make sense often turned out to be the most dangerous. At the lab, the fingertip underwent a full battery of tests: DNA extraction, tissue degradation analysis, toxicology screens. Each step brought the mystery closer to resolution. 2 days later, Sarah received the call she had been expecting, though the answer still made her skin prickle. The fingertip belonged to Vanessa Cole, a 34-year-old waitress who had vanished without a trace 2 months earlier. The missing persons case had gone cold almost immediately. There had been no forced entry at her home, no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints or blood at the scene. She had simply disappeared, as if the city had swallowed her whole. Sarah reopened the case file. Photographs of Vanessa stared back at her from neatly stapled pages, a warm smile, dark hair, eyes that seemed alive with motion, even in still images. The thought of that woman reduced to a severed fingertip was unsettling in a way Sarah had learned never to get used to. The chipped red nail polish was present in the photographs too, a small but striking detail that made the link undeniable. The next step was understanding how that fingertip had ended up inside Emily Carter. Sarah spread maps across her desk, marking points where Vanessa had last been seen, her apartment, and Emily's home address. The two women's lives didn't seem to overlap at all, except for one subtle connection. Emily lived just 3 blocks from the diner, where Vanessa had worked. It was close enough to make Sarah wonder if there had been incidental crossings, shared sidewalks, passing glances, moments that meant nothing at the time but could now hold significance. Still, proximity alone wasn't enough to explain something so bizarre. Sarah called Dr. Hayes for a detailed account of Emily's medical history, focusing on any surgical procedures or hospital visits in the last year. Everything appeared ordinary until one entry caught Sarah's attention. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had undergone a minor surgical repair following a biking accident. The procedure had been performed by a visiting physician, Dr. Lucas Reed, a name Sarah didn't recognize. She began digging. Reed's employment history was full of abrupt moves and short-term contracts. Hospitals in different states, some in other countries, each lasting no more than a year before he disappeared from their staff lists. There were no public disciplinary records, but Sarah's instincts told her the gaps were intentional, that they hid something no one had successfully documented. Her pulse quickened as she opened old case files from other jurisdictions. 2 of Reed's former patients had died under strange circumstances. One from unexplained internal trauma, another from an infection traced back to a foreign object found during an autopsy. Neither case had resulted in charges. Both had been quietly closed. The more Sarah read, the clearer it became. Reed was the kind of man who moved like smoke, slipping through systems without leaving a trace, except for the bodies he left behind. And if he had been the one to operate on Emily, the fingertip inside her body was no accident. It was deliberate. If you want, I can now expand Chapter 4 with the same style, building up Dr. Lucas Reed's disturbing presence and tightening the web around Emily. This is where the story turns from unsettling to truly chilling. Detective Sarah Whitmore's search for information on Dr. Lucas Reed took her deep into places most investigators rarely went. His name wasn't on any criminal record, but it appeared in ways that suggested deliberate erasure. Hospital directories listed him for short stretches of time, followed by abrupt disappearances. References from former colleagues were brief, vague, and strangely uniform. None of them criticized him directly, but all avoided giving any details about his work. It was as if every witness had been coached to say just enough to satisfy a form without revealing a single truth. Sarah found traces of his presence in medical forums, travel logs, and expired visa records. Reed had worked in multiple countries, often in high-turnover medical facilities or private clinics with minimal oversight. One particular detail unsettled her: a 3-year period spent in Southeast Asia, where several clinics had later been exposed as fronts for illegal organ trafficking. No charges had ever been brought against their doctors, but local rumors painted a disturbing picture: patients disappearing mid-treatment, surgeries that were never recorded in hospital logs, families given falsified death certificates. Back in the city, where Emily lived, Sarah began piecing together Reed's last documented movements. The clinic where Emily's biking accident had been treated had hired him only weeks before her surgery. He was filling in for a surgeon on extended leave. His hiring file included only a single reference, from a facility that no longer existed. There was no proof of his qualifications beyond photocopied certificates, some of which Sarah suspected could be forged. The security footage from Emily's procedure was supposed to be standard, a wide-angle view of the operating room, time-stamped and archived. But when Sarah requested it, she discovered the recording was incomplete. The first hour was intact, showing the surgery proceeding normally under the observation of 2 nurses. Then, without warning, the feed cut to static for exactly 23 minutes before resuming as though nothing had happened. That gap coincided almost perfectly with the point in the operation where Dr. Reed had been alone with Emily. The clinic's IT department blamed a technical malfunction, but Sarah didn't believe in coincidences that convenient. She knew what deliberate erasure looked like, and this had the hallmarks of intentional tampering. Someone had wanted to hide exactly what happened in that operating room. The more she dug, the more disturbing patterns emerged. In 2 other cities, Sarah uncovered patient records that mirrored Emily's minor procedures performed by Reed, followed, weeks later, by unexplained medical findings. In one case, a woman undergoing a routine abdominal surgery later developed internal pain. Doctors discovered a small glass vial lodged deep inside her. In another, a man's post-operative checkup revealed a thin strip of cloth sewn into his muscle tissue. Both objects were traced to other missing persons cases in those regions, but without a living witness who could link them to Reed, no charges had been filed. Sarah couldn't shake the thought that Reed's actions weren't just about harming people. There was a message behind them. Leaving evidence inside living bodies wasn't random. It was calculated, almost ritualistic. If the fingertip inside Emily truly belonged to Vanessa Cole, then Reed had intentionally chosen her as the carrier for a fragment of his previous victim. Whether it was a signature, a taunt, or some kind of trophy, Sarah didn't yet know. She pulled up his last known address, a rented apartment not far from the clinic. The landlord described Reed as polite but distant, always paying rent in cash and never allowing maintenance workers inside. After he left, the unit had been found completely bare. No furniture, no personal belongings, not even a scrap of paper. It was as if he had erased himself from the space entirely. Standing in the empty apartment, Sarah felt the silence pressing in on her. The walls seemed too clean, the floor too untouched, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something of him lingered here. Not physically, but in the air, in the knowledge of what he had done. She knew that finding Reed wouldn't be a matter of simply tracking a runaway doctor. She was hunting a man who had made a career out of vanishing, and if he was still in the city, she was certain of one thing. He already knew she was looking for him. The lead that brought Detective Sarah Whitmore to the outskirts of the city came from an unremarkable source, half-forgotten property tax record buried in county archives. The name on the deed wasn't Lucas Reed's, but the date of purchase and the absence of any mortgage raised her suspicion. The owner, a man with no real employment history, had a paper trail that felt manufactured. A closer look revealed that he had entered the country under a different name, one that matched a false identity Reed had used overseas. The property was a farmhouse, long abandoned to anyone passing by. Its peeling white paint and sagging roof gave the impression of neglect. The grass grew high around the structure, and the windows were dark, their glass clouded by years of grime. Sarah knew appearances could be deceiving. She parked her car 100 yards away and approached on foot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the uneven ground. The front door was locked, but the wood was brittle from years of weather. It gave way easily under her push. Inside, the air was stale and faintly metallic, carrying a scent she recognized from crime scenes. A blend of rust, chemical preservative, and something older, something human. The first floor was empty, dust layered thick over every surface, but a narrow set of stairs led downward into a basement. The basement door was heavier than she expected, its frame reinforced with steel plates. It took effort to pry it open, but when she did, the smell intensified sharply. The narrow staircase descended into darkness. Sarah clicked on her flashlight and began to move slowly, each creak of the wooden steps sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. The beam of light swept across the space, revealing walls lined with industrial shelves. At first, she thought they held ordinary storage containers, but as she moved closer, the truth became sickeningly clear. Large glass jars sat in neat rows, each filled with a cloudy preservative fluid. Inside them were human remains, fingers, ears, strips of skin, and in one chilling case, an entire forearm suspended in liquid. A metal table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained in a way that no amount of cleaning could erase. Surgical tools lay scattered beside it, scalpels, clamps, bone saws, all meticulously sharpened and polished. A tray of small labeled jars contained teeth, each marked with a number and date. It wasn't chaos, it was organized, deliberate and methodical. Against the far wall stood a locked cabinet. Sarah forced it open, revealing a stack of patient files, some marked with names she recognized from missing persons bulletins. The top file was Vanessa Cole's. Clipped to it was a photograph she had never seen in the case file, a picture taken after Vanessa had gone missing. She was alive in the image, but bound to the same metal table in the center of this room. The sight made Sarah's chest tight. On the shelf beneath the files was a row of small, airtight bags. Each contained an object that clearly didn't belong in a medical setting. A child's hair ribbon, a broken watch, a blood-stained scarf, and there, near the back, was an empty slot labeled Emily Carter. The fact that her name had been printed and stored here in advance told Sarah everything she needed to know. Emily hadn't been a random patient. She had been chosen. Sarah backed away slowly, her flashlight beam trembling despite her steady grip. Every detail of the basement screamed that this was more than a killing site. It was a workshop, a gallery, and perhaps even a message board for the man who had built it. She could almost feel him here, watching through the memory of his work, knowing she had finally stepped into his world. As she climbed the stairs back to the daylight, her mind turned over the same thought again and again. Finding Reed wasn't just about stopping a killer. It was about ending a game he had been playing for years. A game in which every victim was a carefully selected piece, and Emily's discovery at the clinic had been his first move in whatever came next. If you want, I can now expand Chapter 6 so the story reaches its tense, open-ended conclusion with maximum suspense for your YouTube audience. That's where we leave Reed as a shadow still moving somewhere beyond reach. By the time the warrant for Dr. Lucas Reed was issued, he was already gone. His apartment had been stripped bare days earlier, his phone disconnected, his bank accounts emptied in a single sweep. Airline records showed no recent flights under his name, but Sarah Whitmore knew better than to trust official manifests. Men like Reed didn't rely on commercial travel. They slipped across borders through the cracks, using forged documents, cash and connections built in places most people never dared to go. Emily Carter became the reluctant center of a case that now stretched beyond her understanding. Though she had been cleared of any wrongdoing, she could not free herself from the knowledge that a piece of a murdered woman had been inside her body. It was no longer just a disturbing fact, it was a constant shadow, something she carried in her mind every time she was alone. Even in the safety of her apartment, she found herself checking locks twice, sometimes 3 times, before she could sleep. She avoided crowded places, not out of fear of strangers but because she feared she might see a familiar face in the crowd. Dr. Hayes returned to his practice, but the discovery in his examination room remained etched into his memory. He replayed the moment over and over, the unexpected resistance he had felt during the procedure, the way the fingertip had seemed almost too perfectly preserved, and the expression on Emily's face when she realized what it was. The clinic was quieter now. A subtle undercurrent of unease hung in the air among the staff, as if everyone sensed that something dangerous had brushed against their world and might return without warning. Linda Marlowe resigned within the month. She never told anyone the real reason, only that she was ready for a change. In truth, she could not walk past the clinic's storage room without feeling the weight of that locked evidence box in her mind. Sometimes she thought she could still smell the faint chemical tang from the sealed pouch. It lingered like an invisible stain she couldn't scrub away. Sarah, meanwhile, threw herself into the hunt. She worked with international task forces, combing through medical registries, immigration records, and lists of recently hired surgical staff in countries where oversight was weakest. For months, every promising lead dissolved into nothing. A doctor who matched Reed's height but not his voice. A passport photo that bore a passing resemblance but was off just enough to dismiss. Reed's movements, when they appeared at all, seemed designed to taunt her. Then came the message. It arrived in an unmarked envelope with no return address, slid under the door of her office. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the farmhouse basement, lit by a dim, yellowed bulb. The metal table was bare, but on it lay a sealed evidence pouch, the one that had once held Vanessa Cole's fingertip. It was empty. There was no note, no demand, no threat spelled out in words. The image was enough. Sarah understood it for what it was. Proof that Reed had been there after she left. Proof that he had walked into the space she thought she had secured and touched the evidence she believed was safe. It was a reminder that the game was still his to control. The photograph went into the official file, but Sarah kept a copy pinned to her desk. Every morning, she looked at it before starting work, letting it sharpen her focus. She knew Reed would surface again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Men like him thrived on control, and control was never complete without the next move. Somewhere, in some city, under some new name, Lucas Reed was still working. Emily's name had been printed on a label in that basement for a reason. Sarah didn't know if that reason had already been fulfilled, or if it was still waiting for its moment. The thought that haunted her most wasn't that she might never catch him, it was the possibility that he had already chosen his next patient, and that somewhere, another person was walking into a clinic for a routine procedure, unaware that their life was about to be carved into his collection.